Good morning. I am delighted to be back. I want to begin by talking about a trend in publishing right now. A lot's been written in the last few years by journalists about what they're calling the empathy deficit, in America. This is the idea that we're just not doing very well at caring for one another anymore. When we see others struggle, the first question we ask is not how can I help, but do they belong to the same group as me? Do they vote like me? Do they worship like me? Do they love like me? Do they look like me? And if they don't, then our empathy shrinks. Sociologists and researchers are alarmed that if this empathy deficit is not filled, it could rip our society apart. Interestingly, though, on the other side, there's another argument being made and growing in popularity, particularly among evangelical Christians, and it's the argument not that we have an empathy deficit, but that we are too empathetic. They've actually dubbed the phrase the sin of empathy. And the argument here is that we are caring too much for people who are doing things that we disagree with. And we should not extend empathy, but we should remind them of God's truth. So which side is right? Do we suffer from an empathy deficit in this country, or is the church suffering from too much empathy toward those that we may disagree with? Well, to get at that, I want to talk about the connection between empathy and identity. To begin, I want to talk to you about a study from the UK. A group of researchers collected a bunch of soccer fans, football fans as they refer to on the other side of the pond, and they were particularly looking for Manchester United fans, and they brought them together and they gave them a questionnaire. And the survey was carefully written and designed to emphasize their allegiance to Manchester United. So as they left that session after having taken this questionnaire, what was supposed to be front of their mind was their identity as a Manchester United soccer fan. But the researchers told them that there's a second part to their research, and they needed to watch a film about football in an adjacent building. And as they walked from one building to the other, the researchers had hired an actor to play a jogger passing by each participant. And as the jogger walked by, he would fall and fake injure himself and cry out in pain. And they were testing to see how many Manchester United fans would stop and help the jogger. What made the test interesting is that about half the time the jogger was wearing a Manchester United jersey. Half the time he would wear either a plain white t-shirt or the jersey of Liverpool, the arch rivals of Manchester United. Here's what happened. When the actor wore a Manchester jersey, the Manchester United fans stopped and helped him about 92% of the time. But when he wore something else, they only stopped and helped him about 30% of the time. Here's what the researchers concluded. When we see someone else as sharing our identity, when they belong to the same group that we belong to, we extend empathy. But when we are viewing them as different, when they belong to a different identity group, then our empathy shrinks. The key finding was that identity defines the scope of our empathy. With that in mind, let's look at 2 Kings 5. This remarkable story begins with an introduction to two characters. First, there's Naaman, who's described as a great man. He's at the very top of society, second only to the king of Aram. He's the leader, commander of the king's armies. He's powerful. He's famous. And then we're introduced to someone at the very other end of the social hierarchy, this young girl. She has three strikes against her. First, she's young in a society that values the old. She's female in a society that values men. And she's a foreigner. She's an Israelite slave. She is the lowest of the low. She's so low that she's not even given a name in the story because she's that unimportant. So we have the great man Naaman at the top and this slave girl at the bottom. These two characters appear to have no overlapping identity, nothing in common, no bridge for empathy to cross over. They are Manchester United and Liverpool. They are the Bears and the Packers. And yet, this story is all about empathy and transformation. When we reduce people to a single identity, we cut off the possibility of care. We cut off the possibility of building empathy for one another. And unfortunately, there are a lot of voices and forces in our culture today, whether they are political or cultural or economic or even religious, that are constantly trying to reduce you and everyone else to just a single identity. You are just a Democrat or just a Republican. You are just Team Blue or Team Red. You are just white or black or Asian or Hispanic. You are just gay or straight. You are just iPhone or Android. You are just vax or anti-vax. You are one thing. And when you meet somebody and their one identity is different than yours, they are not to be empathized with, they are to be criticized. This reduction of people to a single identity is what fuels the empathy deficit in America. It's why we struggle so much to care about our neighbor when our neighbor's not just like us. But it also explains the growth, even among Christians, in the view that empathy itself is sinful. Because you see, when you only view yourself and others as possessing a single identity and no empathy can cross between you, then what fills that gap? Some will say the only thing that can fill that gap is truth. Hard truth. You should not empathize with that person you disagree with. You need to fight with them. You need to argue with them. You need to tell them why they and their identity is wrong. So, a single identity erases empathy and fills the vacuum with truth and often anger. But there's a better way, another way. Let's go back to 2 Kings 5. There are two critical details about Naaman and this young Israelite girl that you need to see. First, Naaman had leprosy. The text is actually ambiguous about what his skin disease actually was, but it wasn't good. It was something that caused him great pain, both physical and probably social. And there's an important detail about the young girl. Verse 2 says, bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She wasn't just a slave, as awful as that was. She was kidnapped, she was stolen, she was taken away from her family and her home. She was a captive. And to make matters worse, Naaman probably led the army that captured her and stole her from her family, and now she's a servant in the household of her captor. Think about that. Not only did these two people have completely different identities at opposite ends of the social hierarchy, they had utterly opposed identities. Naaman is the villain, and this young girl, his victim. And despite that massive gap in their identities, somehow empathy reached them both. Verse 3, she said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." This young, amazing girl who had been kidnapped and enslaved, the lowest of the low in that society, somehow looked upon her captor, this great man at the top of society, and she had empathy for him. How? The kindness that she shows to Naaman kickstarts one of the most amazing chapters in the Hebrew Bible. Her empathy begins to transform Naaman's life. He goes to Samaria. He searches for this prophet. He is miraculously healed. His life is completely transformed. He forsakes all of the idols of his homeland, devotes himself to the God of Israel. A complete transformation, and it all begins because this young girl found the capacity to show empathy to somebody who was completely different from her. How? Let's go back to that research project in the UK with the soccer fans. The same team redid the experiment, but they made it slightly different. Once again, they invited Manchester United fans to take a survey, but the survey was rewritten. And the questions were designed not to emphasize their identity primarily as Manchester United fans, but instead they were written to emphasize their overall identity as a soccer fan. And so when they left that room and they started going across the way to the other building, the same thing unfolded. They hired an actor to fake an injury as he was jogging by. Sometimes he wore a Manchester United jersey, sometimes a Liverpool jersey, sometimes just a plain t-shirt. What happened this time? 80% of the Manchester United fans stopped and helped him regardless of what shirt he wore. Why? The survey questions had been carefully designed not to emphasize their narrow identity as a Manchester fan, but to expand their identity so they would see themselves as a soccer fan. And once they saw themselves as a soccer fan and they saw the jogger who was injured, it didn't matter that he had a Liverpool shirt on because they saw him as sharing their identity. Oh, he's a soccer fan too. And once his identity and their identity overlapped, a bridge was built for empathy. Here's the point. There are voices seeking to narrow your identity, and there is the voice of Christ who is calling us to expand our identity. There are forces in this world that want you at odds with your neighbor because they're different, and there is the voice of the Spirit of God who is calling you to love your neighbor because you also, like him, are made in God's image. We have more than one identity. We all carry multiple identities, and as we recognize the multiplicity of our identities, the opportunity for more and more empathy with people who are very different than ourselves grows. And I think that's what happened between this young girl and Naaman. He was a great man, she was enslaved. He was from Aram, she was from Israel. They seemed to have nothing in common, but they did share one identity. They both knew pain. This young girl had lost her home. She'd lost her family. She'd been taken away from everything that she'd loved. And she no doubt struggled and was in pain because of her loss. And somehow she looked at her captor, this great man, and she saw him in pain with his skin disease. And somehow she had empathy for him because she recognized him as a fellow human who's in pain. And her pain and his pain built a bridge of empathy. Their identities overlapped in a miraculous and unexpected way. And through that overlapping identity where empathy was shared, transformation began in Naaman's life. That's how empathy becomes transformative between the most unlikely people. I saw something similar just a few months ago. In May, I went to Israel with my son, actually. Wasn't there as a tourist. It's not the best time to go to the Holy Land if you've been watching the news. But we went with a small group of Christian leaders to meet with both Israelis and Palestinians who have been impacted by this war. We met with victims of October 7th. We met with hostage families. We met with Palestinians both in Israel and in the West Bank who are suffering terribly, including Palestinian Christians and church leaders. It was a really difficult but very important trip. On our last day there, just outside Jerusalem, we met with two men. One was an Israeli Jew named Ramy, and the other a Palestinian Muslim named Bassam. If that were their only two single identities, Israeli Jew and Palestinian Muslim, they would have no connection, no bridge for empathy, no way to care for one another. And yet, the crazy part is Bassam and Ramy are best friends. They genuinely love one another. Bassam actually said to us, "I love that old ugly Jew," who happened to be sitting right next to him. He said, "He's my brother." How is that possible? It's not possible if you only have one identity. If their only identity is Israeli and Palestinian, then the world tells us they have nothing in common and they should just hate one another. But they share another identity. They share many identities, but the one that brought them together is they are both fathers. As Ramy put it, he said, "We share the same pain." Ramy's 14-year-old daughter was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber in Jerusalem. Bassam's 10-year-old daughter was shot in the back and killed by an Israeli soldier. Before losing their daughters, these two men didn't know anyone from the other community. And neither of them felt much empathy for those of the other community. But their pain, like the young Israelite girl and Naaman, brought them together. Their shared identity as grieving fathers created a bridge for empathy to be extended. And eventually that empathy grew into genuine love and respect and friendship. They both belong to a group called the Parent Circle. It's comprised of about 700 Palestinian and Israeli families who have all lost children in the conflict. They gather together, they grieve together, they love one another, and they advocate for peace in a place that is torn apart by an empathy deficit, and where single identity is reinforced over and over and over again. But they show what is possible when we refuse to see ourselves and others as only possessing one identity, and we recognize our full humanity and theirs. Or as Bassam said to us, there is power in pain. We can use it for destruction or for hope. In these contentious weeks before the presidential election, when our country perhaps suffers an empathy deficit greater than at any other time, I want to challenge you with 3 ideas. Number 1, what voices are you listening to? Just like those soccer fans, they were influenced by those who were reinforcing a narrow vision of identity, just a Manchester fan, but they also had their identity expanded when they heard voices telling them, no, it's bigger than Manchester, it's about soccer. What voices are you listening to right now? Are they voices that are constantly reinforcing a narrow identity for yourself or others? Secondly, in this season of division and anger, I challenge you to deliberately seek out people with whom you do not appear to have anything in common. You have an opportunity right now to sign up for, what is it called? DSGs, right? Get into a DSG. And even if you look around the circle and everyone looks like you or you think you have something in common, get to know somebody who's come from a community different than the one you came from. Get to know somebody whose skin color or ethnicity is different than yours. Get to know somebody that you think comes from a different Christian tradition or who you know is going to vote differently than you in this election. And get to know their story deep enough to the point where you make a connection you didn't expect. Build a bridge to empathy with somebody that the world says you should not empathize with. Even at a campus like Wheaton, that is possible. Be deliberate. And finally, remember, empathy is never a sin. Empathy is never a sin because empathy is at the center of the gospel we believe and the mission we pursue. If you think there's a gap between a young slave girl and a great army commander, if you think there's a gap between a Palestinian and an Israeli, the gap between Christ and us is infinitely wider. He who was equal with God, but did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself to take on the form of a servant, who came to dwell among us, to share in our humanity, who empathized with us so deeply that he shared our brokenness, our pain, our temptations, so that his empathy might embrace even his enemies. This is the gospel we proclaim, that the widest gap in identity imaginable was bridged because of love and empathy. And it is the mission we have been given. The empathy of that young girl is what began the transformation of Naaman's life. The empathy of Christ is what has begun the transformation of this world. And in his presence with us, his spirit with us, the voice of his spirit that tells us to grow our identity large enough to embrace the person that we like least, that transformative voice can grow your identity to build a bridge of empathy with the least likely person you know. And as that happens, as the love of God through us expands, the mission goes forward and this world is transformed. Empathy is never a sin. It is the heartbeat of the gospel we believe and the mission we pursue. Now, to Christ who reigns, together with God the Father and the Holy Spirit, as one God, now and world without end. Amen.